Welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. For over 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB radio or viewing on Open Signal or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Family Care Health, Northwest Health Foundation, and Northwest Natural. Today's program sponsors are Home Street Bank and Wells Fargo. Please join me in showing our appreciation for them. And now onto our program today, which is part of our ongoing series. We call this Home: Wealth, Home Ownership, and Race. The hidden cost of being African American in the United States includes an unrelenting cycle of intergenerational poverty for many families. In his new book, Thomas Shapiro reveals how, quote, the lack of family assets, along with continuing racial discrimination in crucial areas like home ownership, dramatically impact the everyday lives of many Black families, reversing gains earned in schools and on jobs, and perpetuating the cycle of poverty in which far too many find themselves trapped. Our guest, Thomas Shapiro, is a professor of law and social policy and heads the Institute of Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University. His primary interest is racial inequality and public policy. He is author of the award-winning book published in 2004, The Hidden Cost of Being African American: How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality. His new book is Toxic Inequality: How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. Thomas will be in conversation today with Jesse Beason, Vice President of Public Affairs with the Northwest Health Foundation and proud City Club member. Prior to joining the foundation, Jesse served as Executive Director of Proud Ground and as Senior Policy Director of Housing, Culture, and Planning for then Commissioner Sam Adams. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Good afternoon. Tom, I actually want to start right at the beginning, and that's with the title of your book, Toxic Inequality: How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. There's a lot to unpack in that, but let's start at the beginning. Toxic. What does toxic mean in this context?
Thank you for the question. The phrase, the title Toxic Inequality, has a lot of meaning to me, and I really wanted it to be the title of the book for a couple of important reasons. The most important is that the level of inequality where we are in the United States today is something that's very different than we have ever experienced in our own lifetimes. And I wanted a phrase, the word toxic, I thought captures it pretty well, a phrase that qualitatively distinguishes where we are right now in the United States versus the inequality that always exists and probably always will exist. It's a question about its impact and its thresholds. For me, toxic inequality is it's a bad matrix. It's a mix of about 4 or 5 different features that we have not really seen before in this particular combination. And let me just run through them relatively quickly, because I think it's important for us to get a large picture to start with. In the United States today, we are experiencing historic high levels of both income and wealth inequality. Historic high levels that take us back to the late 1920s, right before the Great Depression. And all of the social science data upholds that both our wealth and income inequality are at historic highs, and it's getting worse. Second, the The economic mobility for most American families and the living standards for most American families has stagnated or stalled for the last 2 or 3 decades, depending upon when we want to date it to. So right there's a bad combination of widening inequality and living standards and economic mobility getting harder for most American families. On top of that, for me, a really important third part of this bad mixture, if you will, is how the racial wealth gap in the United States is widening. And let me just give 2 quick numbers, bullet points, if you will, about that. Measured at the 50th percentile, half above and half below, the median wealth of white families in the United States is about $140,000. For African American families at the median, it is about $11,000. For Latino families, it's about $13,700. Now, another way to put that and to talk about it is that then the average African American family has about 6 or 7 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth that that average or typical white family has. In addition to that, that racial wealth gap has been widening over at least a 29-year period of time that we have looked at. Between 1984 and 2013, which was the last data point we looked at, we did a study that looked at the same set of families and followed them over the nearly 3 decades. In 1984, the racial wealth gap, just looking black-white in this particular illustration, starts at $84,000. That's bad enough. But even adjusted for inflation, as the dollars were, when we followed the same families and measured it again in 2013, that gap triples to $245,000. So something very profound is occurring in American society in that period of time, at least by the mid-1980s up until where we are today. Because after all, those are families living same American society, American history, American culture, arguably are not same set of schools and communities, but something else is occurring. Then 2 other quick features for toxic inequality for me. One is the changing demographics in the United States, and I understand it's one that's occurring in this state and this city as well. The demographers tell us that sometime in the year 2041, it was November 3rd at 11:02 a.m. or something like that, America no longer will be a society where any one ethnic or racial group is a numerical majority. Right? And so as those demographics change, the kinds of issues I think we're going to dive into much more deeply today around race, around home ownership, around wealth inequality, I think become even more trenchant. The last aspect I would throw in, and it's really not the last one, it's one that really weaves itself throughout this whole story, and that is the pandering to racial anxiety and fears of immigration that we have seen in the United States, not just in this last electoral cycle, but has been with us for a long period of time, clearly has been ratcheted up and continues to be ratcheted up. So that's in more than a nutshell, that's what toxic inequality means and why I wanted that title.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. I want to talk a little bit about the history part of it. I was on a plane coming back from Atlanta, and I finally got to see Fences. And there are a couple of places where Denzel's character, Troy, highlights some of the problems that he as a black man has in accessing wealth. One, he talks about credit, not being able to get credit. The second is that he makes this comment that he wouldn't have been able to afford his house if his brother hadn't been injured in the Army. And those things got me thinking about some of the historical policies that you identified in your book. So can you briefly outline some of the historical policies in this country that you argue in your book has led to this wealth gap?
Sure, thank you. I think there are policies that led both to the widening wealth inequality we see for the whole society, are essentially the same set of policies that also are widening the racial wealth gap. And so the sources, the drivers are very similar for both of those. And for me, that's really important, because when we get to the point of thinking about solutions, I think that solutions to redress that can be applicable for both widening wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap. The largest driver of wealth inequality in the United States today, and I would also argue for the racial wealth gap, is the federal tax code. Specifically, the $100 billion a year or so that we invest as a society in the mortgage interest deduction, in exclusion of property taxes around the mortgage interest deduction and home ownership, and the exclusion of paying property, state, federal property taxes on that home that one owns. All of those aggregate for approximately $100 billion a year. And it's one thing to think about that $100 billion as a public good for housing security. It's one thing to think about that $100 billion a year as public investment. However, when we look at how it's distributed, there's a very different story that the data tell us there. According to one set of estimates, and the estimates vary, so I want to be real clear about that. One set of estimates that we look at says that 86% of that $100 billion every single year goes to the top 10% of income filers. The reason for that is because people are wealthier, they tend to buy bigger homes, their income tax brackets are bigger, and all of that accumulates in a way that the 86% of that $100 billion a year or so goes to the top 10% of filers. And it then tends not to touch those groups and communities and families whose home ownership and stability of shelter could really be impacted. And the history of that a little bit goes back to the mid-1930s, the Federal Housing Act. Now, I don't know how many people are really familiar with the Federal Housing Act as a piece of history, but it's the real foundation upon which home ownership and home ownership financing and that market has been set today. The rules for that market are set essentially in Washington, D.C., the Treasury Department, Fannie and Freddie, all within the framework of the Federal Housing Act. Prior to 1934, to buy a home in the United States, one needed literally to reach into their back pocket or purse and pay about 90 or 95% of the purchase price in cash. Now, no wonder home ownership rate wasn't very large then. It was also during the Depression. That didn't help either. But the Federal Housing Act and the way it's structured and the government structured home financing literally flipped that entire script, so that after 1934, homes could be purchased with about 5 to 10% down payment, terms people are much more familiar with today, and the other part of it, the 95%, on a long-term, relatively low-interest loan. Now that, to me, I would argue, as a policy expert of sorts, I would really make the case that that's great policy around housing security, around promoting home ownership, with one major exception. By rule of its implementation, that's where we get the word redlining. It was implemented in the guidebooks. Literally, red lines were drawn around communities where the federal government would not guarantee loans, which was part of that, guaranteeing the risk to the banks against the loans was a very central part of the program. That's where we get the term redlining from. And redlining, I would sustain, still exists today in different forms and in different modalities. And those lines were drawn around not just communities of color, but they were drawn around diverse communities. The only communities that consistently and systematically received loans through that government guidance were basically middle class and upper middle class, relatively homogeneous white communities. So we get that history, that legacy, founded in the mid-1930s becomes the incentive for homeownership boom when the economy starts to really take off after World War II in the United States, and we then get a relatively high homeownership rate, but still, I think, goes to part of the explanation of why African American homeownership rate, for example, is about 25% lower, 25 points lower than the white homeownership rate is.
For those of you listening on OPB, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Jesse Beason, Vice President of Public Affairs at Northwest Health Foundation. I'm here with Thomas Shapiro, author of the new book, Toxic Inequality: How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. And we are talking about all that's in that title. You mentioned the down payment side of things. And in my previous role at Proud Ground, we certainly saw a lot of families who struggled to get that 5% down payment. They didn't have a family to go to get that, and it reminded me of the part of your book talking about inheritance and how important inheritance is to creating that wealth gap. And I think you even called an element of that historical amnesia. Can you talk about the role of inheritance in terms of the wealth gap?
Sure. Thank you, Jesse. Wealth has a particular property that income doesn't, and that's why when I and the cohort of folks that I work with look at the kinds of resources individuals and families have, looking at wealth is different because it has the capacity to look into the past. Wealth, unlike income, has the capacity to be passed along from generation to generation, unlike virtually any other resource that an individual or a family has. And indeed, that happens with wealth. So, for example, most Americans do not inherit anything. In fact, only about 35% of Americans inherit $10,000 or more, and this comes from a panel study of nationally representative data that we've looked at. So it's a little over a third. So we want to sort of get that place setter on the table. We're not talking about everybody, but within that there's a big difference. 46% of whites inherit $10,000 or more. 10% of African Americans inherit $10,000 or more. So right from the get-go, an inheritance, let's be clear, is at least for the generation that's getting it, is unearned income, is unearned wealth. And there's a 4.5 times differential just looking at the black-white ratio on that. And that, I think, starts to explain to us why it is that I know in the city of Portland, in a lot of cities, I come from Boston, I have the opportunity to travel and talk about this work all over the country. Buying that first home is very difficult, especially for young adults. Most Americans buying their first home don't do it all by themselves. They do it with significant financial assistance mostly from family members. And it comes in the form of helping them with a down payment. It might be a loan, it might be termed as a loan, but in the work we've done, this comes from interviewing, talking to nearly 200 families, first in 1998 and then again in 2010, 11, and 12, which is the core of the data for the new book, Toxic Inequality. We heard a lot of stories of young first-time homeowners, and tended more often to be white, to be honest. We asked them, tell us the story of how you bought the home. And the story often turned on, well, mom or dad or grandparent helped us with the down payment with a $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 check. And it's a loan. When was that loan given? 5, 8 years ago. Is there a repayment schedule? No. Have you ever paid any of it back? No. It's a popular cultural fiction in a lot of families, on both sides. Parents don't like to say they're giving bulk amount of money to their grown children, and those of us that are grown children everything we earn is positive. We like to think is because of our own merit and our own benefit. So it's hard to talk about that as being a gift. Now the amnesia part, and let me tell a research story, a real family. And bear with me, it'll take a minute or two to get the story out. This was in 1998. We're talking to a family in St. Louis. They lived in St. Louis County, southern part, almost an all-white suburban development at that point in time. And they were talking about how they had just bought a house further down the Mississippi River, where it'd be open space, higher quality of schools, not as much crime, and all this stuff. So we then asked them, tell us the story of how you bought that house. And they tell us the story of, well, we were holding garage sales on every weekend. And we were doing this for months and months. But, and this is my interjection, we all know what a garage sale's like. We're selling our old stuff to our neighbors or anybody else that happens to be driving by, and the inventory runs out pretty quickly. The customers run out pretty quickly. And so the couple that we were talking to in South St. Louis County then told the story. Well, her mother was over for dinner one night, and they were talking about plans for school and where they wanted to move to this great place further down the Mississippi River. And they said, but we just can't get the down payment money together. We can't afford it. We're holding these garage sales all the time, but we're not getting bank. We're not getting money for that. It's not working. Mother reaches into the purse and literally writes a check for $30,000. Now, I wish everybody that can hear me now and is in the audience today would have a family that could write a check for $30,000 and help them for that. I don't want to hold that, that's not the point here. The point is how they got it. Later in the interview, when we asked them to retell the story about how they bought the house, they go through this story that totally omits the $30,000 check. It's disappeared from their memory in the space of like half an hour in the interview. And when the interviewer was not me, it was one of the interviewers in St. Louis, had the presence of mind to say, but remember earlier in the interview you talked about how gracious your mother was with a $30,000 check? And this was the key point for me. The couple turned back to the interviewer and said, but we earned that. We deserved that by having all the garage sales. And it was an incredible flip on the American dream and set of values for me, where they basically repurposed unearned wealth by saying they had achieved it. All right. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience and listeners today have had garage sales, and we all work hard. All right. And yes, we all then also deserve the $30,000 check. But the sense of deservedness is, I think, part of that, what covers as part of the social amnesia and cultural amnesia that people have. Sometimes we like to joke that denial is more than a river in Egypt. It's also about how people can avoid talking about the advantages that they have.
So I think that's a great example of how we've made policies or wealth actually invisible, the wealth transference. But we also do it through our policies, as you mentioned, the mortgage interest deduction and how big of a role it plays, and yet most of us don't really think about it. And I'm frankly one of them. I own a house. I do the mortgage interest, but after I read your book, I went online and I was like, well, how much money am I getting for this mortgage interest deduction? Turns out I'm getting about $40 a month for deducting, and I bought a house for $200 and some odd thousand. $40 a month. I mean, I think I pay my accountant what I just got from my mortgage interest, and I'm wondering how how many families believe that they're benefiting from a tax benefit in which they're not. In fact, I know in Oregon, we also have the mortgage interest deduction at the state level, and only 30% of taxpayers actually qualify for it. So I guess two questions. How do you take the invisible policies that are at play and make them more visible? And two, how do you look at restructuring some of these things to get at the wealth gap?
Great questions. And wow, they're very challenging ones. I think especially the first one. How do we make the invisible visible? The tax code is arcane. You've got to be a geek, a super geek, and a wonk, even to want to talk about it. I mean, come on, let's have a jazzy, sexy conversation. Let's talk tax code. And it's also policy that's written essentially behind closed doors in Washington, D.C. You have never heard the tax code as a part of anybody's election campaign. And you probably never will, for that matter. So part of the issue then becomes, as I and others are claiming and suggesting very strongly, that the tax code is a major driver of creating and maintaining and widening inequality, it becomes a challenge and a task and a project to how do we bring that tax code from an invisible underground conversation to something that's on the policy table and public arena. I will say that a lot of people, some people have been working at this for a long period of time. Tomorrow, it's been posted already, but Matthew Desmond has a piece out in the New York Times Sunday magazine that's a long piece essentially on the mortgage interest deduction. When President Trump first was thinking about tax reform, the mortgage interest deduction was on the docket. In the one-pager that came out, it was removed from that docket, not so strangely. People talk about maybe Social Security as the third rail of American politics. The mortgage interest deduction is the 3.5 rail of American politics. It has a very strong set of interest and lobbyists that don't want it to go away because I think they misunderstand what the reform and progressive movement is talking about. It's essentially the real estate realtors, the real estate market, the construction industry, home builders. They think that building homes will stop, and that really will not be the case at all. I think the moment is really a very propitious moment right now to talk about the mortgage interest deduction as one of those parts of the wealth building budget of the United States government that actively redistributes wealth to the top. I've been chewing and investigating with some friends. Can we possibly remessage the phrase tax reform to wealth redistribution to the top? Because that's what it is, and that's what the impact actually is, and see if that generates a very different conversation. The actual business of reforming it is a lot easier. We could close the doors in this room, and there's about 250 people in the room, and yeah, there'd be some dissenters, but within 15 minutes, we would have 3 or 4 designs that would be much more progressive. And there are a lot of things we could do. We could simply cap it at a certain level. There could be exclusions. There could be exclusions of second, of third homes. There could be ways of spreading it to renters, which is something that we've been able to do in Massachusetts, so that housing security and not just home ownership is a part of public policy. A significant point for me that I would try to make here is that I think the $100 billion a year is a public investment in housing. And instead of wiping it away and, quote, saving money to fill budget deficits somewhere, let's think of that $100 billion as the public investment in housing security and figure out ways to redesign it so that it really reaches the families and communities that need first-time homeownership, that need remodeling and rebuilding assistance, that need help in meeting their mortgages, in getting new people into homeownership, and for renter stability. And all of that for $100 billion can go a long way. Thank you. As a quick point of comparison, I'm a professor, so I'm going to ask a quiz here. I know we've got a live audience, so I can't ask people to raise your hands, so I'll ask it rhetorically. If we were to ask people what the housing policy of the United States government is, 9 out of 10 people on the street, at least 9 out of 10, will say it's rent subsidy, it's public housing. If budgets set priorities, and not just our rhetoric, we spend approximately $35 to $40 billion a year on rent subsidies for people who cannot afford housing, and we invest $100 billion for home ownership. So we invest 3 to 4 times as much for home ownership, arguably for families that would be buying homes anyways, more than we help families who need that assistance.
So I want to talk about its impact locally. So in Portland, a third of black households, a third of Latino households, a third of Native households own their house. But 2/3 of white Portlanders own their house. And even when we compare for income, we see that the homeownership rates are lower. How does Portland compare to other cities that you've studied?
So let me back into that question in the following way. Home ownership is a very different kind of wealth than any other kind of wealth. It's the only kind of wealth that has use value. Right? It's not like it's a stock or bond. It's not like one can sell your home without replacing it. It's got to be replaced. All right, so homes have use value, and we can't just think of it as an quote an investment in that way, although some people in the certain communities like to think of it as just an investment. I think that takes us down the wrong road. Now, if we look at the broad swath of America's middle class, just for now, defined as those between the 20th and the 80th percentile of income earners, that's 60% of folks right in the middle, the huge majority, it would be an electoral landslide we haven't seen the likes of which in a long, long time. 2/3 of the wealth of that middle 60% of Americans, 2/3 of that wealth is in home ownership and home equity. That's how important home ownership is in the relationship to family financial assets and wealth. Now, the Econ 101 tells us a very different story that's incorrect. It tells us the story that wealth is what we don't spend out of our paychecks. It's our thrift, our lack of consumption, our wise investment, and we'll sprinkle in a lot of luck. All right. Well, no, the data tell us a very, very different story. 2/3 of the wealth of America's broad middle class is in a profoundly institutionally bound, policy-grounded arena, home ownership and communities. So that's sort of the macro importance, the relationship, the connection between home ownership and wealth in the United States. So when we look at data, like a third of African Americans or a third of Latinos or a third of indigenous communities are homeowners, and that's half of what it is for whites, it's also telling me something about the financial status, for sure. It's probably telling us something about a certain history or legacy of homeownership in the Portland community as it is in other communities, redlining, exclusionary policies, etc., as well as it's telling me something about which groups are providing access to gain and generate and accumulate and grow their financial assets and their wealth at the same time. Now, in a sense, I would love to turn it back to you to help us and the audience understand sort of what's happening locally with home ownership.
I think in Portland, we are struggling with a few things. One, we have not only rising rents, but the average median sales price in Portland is astronomically unaffordable. And in fact, this whole series started from a report done by the Portland Housing Center that showed that on a basic trend line in 5 years, no one with the median income in Portland will be able to afford a home inside the city, regardless of race. I think we've established a couple of policy tools to help. Policies giving preference to households who have been historically displaced, but the revenue to actually make homes affordable, the subsidy needed at the local level is not there. And I actually want to talk a little bit about our local history in terms of the most recent recession. And I think one of the things I noticed when I worked at Proud Ground was the impact, and I worked there during the recession. So we kind of got bookended in terms of the wealth that was stripped from our communities. We saw so many families of color being foreclosed for sometimes fair reasons, but oftentimes not fair reasons. And the families that potentially could take advantage of lower prices were kept out because banks were unwilling to lend in that era, far more afraid to give credit out. And also we saw cash investors come in and sweep many of the starter homes that would have been affordable to the families of color we were serving. So I'm wondering if you can talk about nationally what happened during the recession that might have contributed to the wealth gap among communities of color.
So the Pew study, the Pew Center did a study only looking at I think it was the first 3 years of the Great Recession, and their data was just astounding. The amount of wealth that was destroyed in the white community was something like 17% of all aggregate wealth in the white community was destroyed. 2/3 of the wealth of the Latino community was stripped and destroyed. 54% of the wealth of the African American community was destroyed and stripped in that short period of time. Now, what, among other things, it tells me is that most of the wealth in African American and Latino communities was in the form of home ownership. And so it was both with homes being foreclosed on, but it was also in the way in which the housing crisis and implosion hit a lot harder and much more deeply in communities of color where there was some home ownership. And those communities still have not rebounded nearly to the extent to which communities that are much more predominantly white have. Those communities are, I'm familiar with Boston and some other areas. The housing market has heated back up. Prices are zooming again. It's becoming even more unaffordable, and I think that sounds like it's a story in Portland as well. The other thing that was happening in different parts of the country, and I'm familiar with it because of the work I've done in St. Louis, Los Angeles, Boston, and a few other cities. I'm going to plead ignorance about Portland, and maybe you can help, or maybe one of the questioners can help us later. The largest homeowner in the United States today is an investment banking group headed by Pete Peterson. And what they have done is they have gone around, and I know people can't see the air quotes that I'm about to hold up. They went around buying distressed properties. Distressed properties meaning foreclosed homes or homes about to be foreclosed, bundled them together and rented them. And that's how we got to be the largest homeowner in the United States today. Now, in some parts of Boston, this story differs. It was in the Spanish Lake part of St. Louis and in some parts of Boston that I'm most familiar with. In communities that had duplexes or triple deckers, it was often the case where a family would live on one level and rent out the other two or the other level as a way of financing their payments and their mortgage. As they were forced out, those homes now become run by absentee landlords, and that has a different impact of the community. So a danger signal to look at in that kind of process is how owner-occupied home ownership in some communities has also been in the process of being transitioned to absentee ownership.
We have a few minutes left, but I want to get to one of the larger themes that you mentioned at the beginning. And you know, there's been no shortage of analysis since the election in November, but a recurring theme seems to be that we need to understand white poverty and white economic insecurity better. But poverty and economic insecurity has been plaguing communities of color for generations, and oftentimes it feels like we're the scapegoats of that anxiety. I'm wondering where you sit in this current national conversation about what we need to do to tackle these real issues.
Sure. Thank you. I get asked all the easy questions. Part of my answer, it really is for all of us to tackle and really have a serious conversation about this. But I think it is amazing in a bad way to watch on the media and to hear conversations where rural communities and working class is being defined as white, and somehow we missed that in the last election. Most African Americans and Latinos are in America's working class. They just are not a numerical majority in that. So if we're talking about class, if you will, we have to talk about class in a way that's intersectional, both with race and ethnicity. About 29% of all Americans work in what's called the low-wage sector. Essentially that sector of the economy that has both low wages and very few, if any, job-related benefits like paid sick leave, like paid vacation time, like contributions to health care, like higher education benefits for children, and really importantly, like retirement savings. A much higher percentage of African Americans and even a higher percentage still of Latinos work in that low-wage sector. And you could redefine it as low-quality job sector, and that's an important part of the equation. So when we talk about poor whites or working class, we really need to understand the composition of that. And the composition of that is that the working class is in fact much more diverse than the middle class or the upper middle class in terms of the representation of families of color within it. And so that's where I would start. I think that if we don't center race in all of those kinds of conversations, that you really miss the boat.
For those of you listening on OPB, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Jesse Beason, Vice President of Public Affairs at Northwest Health Foundation. I'm here with Thomas Shapiro, author of the new book, Toxic Inequality: How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. I want to give you an opportunity to close on the last part of your book, Threatens Our Future. What's really at stake when you bring up all of the issues in your book of the racial wealth gap? What are we talking about is facing not only these families, but our country?
Sure, so now we can go to the dark side. When I have, one reaction I often get when I do presentations or talk about the book is how depressing a picture you're painting. And there are a lot of success stories within that. And a lot of successful examples of public policy like family self-sufficiency. But we don't need to go into those at this particular moment. I do think, but I also hear from people the sense of how dangerous the road is that they think we're heading down. The society becoming much more separated and segregated by race and by class. And we see it, I think, in all kinds of different ways. One of the favorite metaphors I like to think of is what happens when we go to an airport. I travel a lot. What happens when you go to an airport? What happens when you get on a plane? Well, they've created classes. Who gets to go through the faster line? Who gets not to have to take their shoes off and their belts off? Who pays $400 more to sit in the seats that are 3 inches, of more leg room, and you actually get a meal that you might not want anyways? And think about that, but even more importantly, what we don't think about is that small percent of people that don't take those planes, that don't go through those measures, that have private jets, that rent private planes, that get ferried around all across the country and all across the world, that live a very, very different life. And I think the danger, if you will, is that kind of separation and widening of inequality, and the visualization of it about the experience becoming greater and greater, unfortunately will, I think, drive a set of politics that we may not want to confront in our future. I think it's going to drive both an alternative right-wing nativist set of policies, as well as a particular maybe left-wing set of policies that I personally am closer to. But it's a divide that I think we need not go down to. And that's part of the toxicity, if you will, around inequality that sets this era off from something that we haven't seen in quite a while, at least since the Depression.
Let's now go to the audience for some questions. If you've written a question on an index card, please hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. I will try to read at least one index card question and one from Twitter. We invite City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Hello, I'm Emily from Clackamas High, a civic scholar. It's had the pleasure of being here. I was wondering what should or could the upcoming generation do to enter into this field, and like what policy or whatnot could we do to help out this issue?
Thank you for the question. I always am very encouraging of the more we understand about how we have gotten to where we are as a society, the better off we're going to be. And I think that the more people, especially younger generation, that's involved with that in terms of their own study and in terms of their own subsequent careers, that the better off we're going to be. Human capital education is one of the few forms of wealth that nobody can ever take away from you. They can take other things away from us. They can't take away our education. They can't take away our skills. They can devalue it, but that's another question. So I really would prompt, I say this as a college professor too, I really would prompt, if college is right for folks, their careers, it opens up careers. It opens up a lifetime of earnings that's about $1 million more than those that don't graduate high school. And the wealth difference is also incredible. So there's not just a payoff, but it's also about, as I like to tell my son, part of your job in life when you're young is to create as many opportunities for yourself as you possibly can. Make a choice, live by it.
Next question.
Mary Vogel, City Club member. I wonder if we might actually think about the possibility that a housing system that depends on a private commodity speculative market is not, in fact, maybe part of the problem rather than part of the solution. A homeownership system that captures for a few the wealth that the entire community has created. Perhaps we tax ourselves to put in a light rail system or a park or sidewalks and all in a community. Why should just owners be able to, in fact, capture all of that wealth that should actually come back to the community? Anyway, this book, Democratic by Design, how car sharing co-ops and community land trust are reinventing America really points the way toward alternative institutions, and we'll be doing that. In fact, reading this book for our May 25th book club, Portland Urban Planning and Architecture Book Club.
So I will take the question to be, what do I think of community land trusts?
Sure.
Great question. Thank you for the question. For those that don't know, and the design and the form and shape can vary, but essentially community land trusts are properties or bundles of properties that typically a not-for-profit or a community development corporation has developed often for affordable housing. And there often then is a scheme of sorts where not all of the equity is private, but goes back to, once the property is sold, goes back to the organization or is calibrated to how many years a family may have lived there. But it's all built around a premise that Mary was getting to, and that is sort of the principle of the commons, that we have an infrastructure that we generally don't pay for, but it's an infrastructure that makes home ownership possible. We have a mortgage financing system, a set of rules and regulations and laws that protect the lenders and take enough of the risk, that guarantees enough of the risk that allows them to lend us money to buy homes. And that's all part of our laws and customs and infrastructure. And that's for everybody, not just for homeowners. So being open to the kinds of suggestions and solutions that Mary's talking about, I think is not only an eye-opener, but is something that we need to think seriously as we walk down this road.
I used to run a community land trust. I have a lot of thoughts about it. I think one of the problems sometimes when we're crafting public policies and programs is that we need to not just focus on creating the program, but who benefits from the program. And so if we're talking about the racial wealth gap, how do we design programs that ensure they actually reach those folks? And I think that's an important part of following the implementation side. And I want to go to one of the questions from the card. What do you think are some of the solutions to shift some of the investments? Or I'll put it another way. If you had the $100 billion piggy bank of the mortgage interest deduction pool of money, what would you start to do differently from a policy perspective?
Oh, goody, I get to be king or queen for the day. I love it. First of all, I would reframe it as housing security. I would put a cap or a limit on the amount of interest that can be deducted. That would be somewhere around the price of the median house, maybe in an urban area to make it more reasonable, and use some of the rest of the $100 billion to talk about how we can help renters. I know in my state of Massachusetts, if your income is below a certain level, you can take up to 15 or 20% of your rent off of your state taxes. And that was done to provide equity between homeowners and renters. And I think that there could well be a federal analog to that as well. And that's where I would start. You know, I think the simplest solutions are often the best ones. I, of course, would want to model through what the distributional breakdown would look like. But you know, I would also add to that as we know, families that earn less than $50,000 or $55,000 don't itemize their deductions because they don't have enough other expenses. So we would like to figure out a design that also allows them to take advantage of the mortgage interest deduction as well.
Next question.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. Looking at budgets like the federal budget, it's very easy to be confused and not understand what's really going on. You're talking about the $100 billion, and I'm sure that shows up as a revenue and then as an expenditure, when really you're not getting the money and you're not spending the money. Do you think there's a way to make our budget show what really is going on so people like Republicans can't say, oh, we're raising all this money and we're spending all this money?
I think in the conversation and the messaging about it, I think we really do need to drive to make it much more simple and accessible to people. I think, you know, a lot of the language around budgetary items and schemes tends to, you know, eyes glaze over. I think there's some pretty simple charts and tables that some organizations, tax policy organizations in this state and nationally put out all the time that tend to make that information and data much more accessible and understandable to people. And that's where, you know, that's where I would start as well. I would also go back to remessaging. And this, you know, I will get onto this sort of personal passion, I suppose. I'm not going to use the phrase tax reform anymore. When I understand that what's at stake is really a redistribution of wealth to the top, we should talk about it as redistribution to the top and not reform. And begin squarely to label it what the story really needs to be titled as. And so let's think about, you know, what tax reform really means.
All right, I think we have time for one more question from the back.
Hello, Maisie Moon, Portland City Club member. Do you think the problem really is that people without money have no money, or rather how we view value is the real problem? In other words, do you think that what we view as currency could ever change or have a different definition?
Will you repeat the last part of your question? In other words?
Do you think that what we view as currency could ever change or have a different definition?
I'm sorry, by currency, are you meaning money?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. That helps. I'm not sure. You know, I've really not thought about that deeply. You know, there's a lot of, in the literature and world I work with, we talk about human capital, social capital, all the things that can't really be monetized in that way. But as a social scientist, as a sociologist who works in the policy world, looking at the distributional impact of a policy and whether it is equitable or not often comes down to pretty hard, if not crude, dollars. And just for getting that analysis across is what tells us how equitable policy is, or how it might be actually widening the racial wealth gap or widening inequality. And so the numbers, I don't want to lose that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of broadcast time for today, and we'll have to stop with the questions. If this program has inspired you to join us here as a member of City Club or to donate to our annual fund, you of course are welcome to do so in the back of the room. Thank you to our guests today, and a big special thank you to our Friday Forum Committee, as well as our community partners for this program: Portland Housing Center, Agora Center for Journalism at the University of Oregon, Echo Northwest, Oregon Humanities, and North Star Civic Foundation. This series of programs is made possible with the generous support from J.P. Morgan Chase. I'm Courtney Nelson, President of City Club. Thank you for joining us today.